Hey guys, welcome back. We're Telltale. I'm Emily.
I'm Greg.
And we are going to do a book review today.
This is our first one.
This is our first book review. We're so excited. So the first book we decided to read together was Herland. It is kind of a science fiction-y, classic feeling book. I don't think the author really intended for it to be science fiction at first. I think it was just supposed to be a social commentary from what I read and understood.
Well, at that time, science fiction didn't exist as a genre.
Mm-hmm.
Wells's works were called, what do they call them, scientific fantasies or something like that.
Yeah.
And, the term science fiction didn't exist until 1928, when it was invented. And this particular novel was actually an answer. It's part of a trilogy of novels that are in answer to the book that I've been reading, H.G. Wells's When the Sleeper Wakes.
So we kind of pulled this. Well, one, I was just kind of perusing, trying to find a piece of literature that I would find interesting. And I have a lot of books I love. But science fiction was kind of what I wanted to lean to, and then at first I was like, maybe I should pick something that's not science fiction. But then I ended up picking something that was science fiction anyway, thinking that it wasn't. So to kind of give you guys a background, the synopsis of this story is a doctor, a sociologist, and a rich kid, young man, 3 young men, walking onto a boat. They all are friends from school, and they decide that they're going to go on this exhibition with the scientific group together. And while they're on this exhibition, all the tribes that they encounter talk about how there's this land of legend that has only women, where there are no men. It's entirely isolated culture, and they are entirely self-sufficient. And all these tribes just have no contact with them. It's ends up being kind of... You find out later in the story that these women were part of a tribe of both men and women who ended up being isolated through earth science means, where there's some seismic activity and some flooding and a lot of different things, kind of this perfect storm of earth science-related activities isolated them on this plateau that was too high to climb down from safely, but it was big enough to sustain a population. So
I think they compared it in size to Holland, if I remember right.
Yeah, so it was, so they just kind of built a civilization, and originally they were what they call a bisexual nation, where they had men and women, and eventually the men kind of started dying off, and then desperation caused the men to become really abusive, and so the women kind of girded up their loins and decided to do something about it, and eventually they actually barbarically slaughtered all the men, and then were just trying to sustain a life with the generations that they had of all women. So what ends up happening later is eventually they develop the ability to asexually reproduce, where the women don't need men anymore. They just suddenly become pregnant, almost like immaculate conception, and they're able to birth only girls. So they kind of develop this entire culture around womanhood and motherhood, and actually kind of deify the first woman who ever became immaculately concepting, or however you would say it. The first woman who ever became pregnant, essentially. So they kind of developed this really interesting non-deity-based religion. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Buddhism, where you kind of have this one very human person, an icon, who everybody kind of recognize, who developed like all these philosophies about beauty and teamwork and education and motherhood, essentially, which is what this entire culture is based off: motherhood, beauty, and education. So that's their 3 basic pillars of their belief system. So it's just this really fascinating story about these 3 men who go on this exhibition and decide, we're going to get a plane and come back with the 3 of us by ourselves when this scientific expedition is over. And we're going to go see what's on that plateau that all these tribes, keep telling us about, because there can't possibly be a culture entirely of just women. So with their version of modern day ideals and all the debates that they have on the way, they kind of think, oh, if they're women, they're probably really scrappy and bratty, and they can't possibly be a civilized country, and they can't possibly have a government or a society, not without men anyway. So they kind of delve into this entire culture of just women, which they're absolutely shocked by. Then they're absolutely, freaked out by. And then they're trying to escape, because then they become captured. Because, of course, these women haven't seen men for, I think they said, about 2,000 years?
2,000 years.
2,000 years and generations without men. And these are the first 3 men that they see. And so they kind of capture these guys and start asking questions about the world outside. And it's a very interesting dynamic, because these women built this society on motherhood, and mothers in this, in this era, it was thought that mothers were very practical. So this entire society is based off of extreme practicality to the best of their ability. So sometimes the men would be like, don't you have animals and cows and stuff? And they're like, those aren't sustainable. We got rid of those. We developed plants to do everything we need for food, and nuts and things for proteins. And so they're like, oh, well, how did you develop engines? Because their culture actually has vehicles, moving vehicles and stuff. So they're like, we just did? Science is science at the end of the day. So they were just basically confused as to why these guys were, one, so shocked about how they did their culture, but they themselves also were becoming more and more shocked, because as they started interviewing the men and putting them on public display and having public discussions and having people meet them, people would ask hard questions, and the women were shocked about how they treated other women in their culture, and they were, trying to understand and grasp how a family dynamic works when you have both a male and a female. So it was a really interesting book to read, and it was also really fun to watch a bunch of dudes put their foot in their mouth while they're trying to figure out how to make their culture seem good in comparison to this other culture, but this other culture seems to be so superior to theirs, and they're trying to understand how this happened and why this happened, and trying to understand how they can fit into it, essentially, because they feel like at this point now we're kind of stuck here. So trying to find their place and their own meaning in the society of all women, who are not at all like the women they're used to from their culture. So it's really kind of a comedy in a way.
When I read a synopsis of this book is even though it was lost for something like 60 years, it is considered to be an important feminist text. So reading the synopsis and reading that, you're thinking, okay, this is going to be a total we hate men, get rid of them kind of book. And a lot of people do take it that way, but when I read it, no, there wasn't anything of that in there. What it was, under the surface, was a philosophical idea of how society could achieve better results for all of its people, not just women, not just men, but to create a society that has fewer wars, that has lower poverty, that has higher education, that is more sustainable than what we really have today. Gilman had a lot of good ideas, but unlike the first 2 novels in the trilogy, this was actually a story, and it was an enjoyable read. So on the surface, you got this adventure story of these guys finding this lost civilization and getting involved with this whole society, because they won't let them leave, so they have no choice but to try to fit in, and they learn, 2 of them learn that they like it.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the one. You'll have to read about that, though. Nicholas. He was an interesting character, because he's definitely a man's man who's really in favor of the patriarchy. He was actually the one who had the hardest time adjusting. But before we get into that, one of the things that I noticed when I was researching the book more and taking in reviews and things and seeing what other people thought is a lot of people didn't actually believe this was a feminist work, or at least a relevant one, because it was written so long ago with such a different perspective. And most of it, the two biggest arguments were, one, that it did not focus on the individuality of the female enough, and two, it focused too much on motherhood. And in modern feminism, that makes sense. A lot of modern feminism did develop in Western cultures, where we as women want to be seen, I guess, more or less, as individuals who have relevant ideas and are a particular, individual person. We want to be seen as autonomous. We want to be seen as an equal. And a lot of the time, we want to be allowed to make the choice whether we're mothers or not, or whether we're career women, or whether, be able to make those choices for ourselves. So based off of those two complaints, a lot of people are like, this really isn't a true feminist work because it doesn't uphold the ideals. And I actually have a counterpoint to that, where basically, again, we have to look at the context in which this was written. During that period of time, basically all you could be as a woman was a secretary, a working girl, or a mom. Those were your options. You didn't have more. Or you were a maid or something else, but nobody really wanted those jobs if you were part of high society. You were better off just being a mother and a hostess to your own home, essentially. So when you look at it in that context, you kind of see that the emphasis of this culture being on motherhood is very normal for the 1920s. And you also see a little bit of a socialist ideal, I think, is why a lot of people have offense to this, because from Western culture, we are individualists. We want to be seen as special. We want to be seen as relevant for our own ideas and our own innovations and our own personal stuff. But the society that Herland is a socialist one. It's basically a collectivist. Collectivist is probably a more friendly term to use, where their focus is not on the individual, but on the whole. Everything you do is for the greater good of your nation, or for the greater good of your community, or for the greater good of your family. So they think on a scale of individual decisions for the person next to them. And in this case, it would be for their children, for the most part. They didn't necessarily worry about what they did for the greater good of each other, but for the daughters that they were giving birth to. So that's kind of where this collectivist motherhood kind of comes into it. And it makes perfect sense for their society, because that's what they had to do at the time to make it work. If they had gotten individualist and had started thinking in terms of, well, this is what I want to do, no, this is what I want to do, they would be a more bickersome and probably a more brutal society. But they had to band together in order to survive, and eventually it paid off through some miraculous and potentially scientific things that they claim to have happened to build this society. So ultimately, I think it still is considered a feminist work. It's just a feminist work for its time. Mm-hmm. And it's also, when you consider it, feminism is about being able to have the choice. To be able to have the choice to be a mom or not, to be a career woman or not, to be a wife or not. So if we want to talk about this in terms of true feminism, the whole point is having the ability to choose for oneself, which, when you think about it, is very feminist ideal. And they all have equality, which is also the ultimate feminist ideal. All these women are equal. They make sure they take care of each other, they take care of their communities, and they have careers, and they're moms, and they have pets even that they've developed and things like that. So I feel like this is still a very relevant feminist work. It's just not what we're used to seeing, especially as part of Western culture.
Yeah, Gilman definitely saw in her society of the time that, as she stated in, I don't know if it was in Herland or one of the other three books, but she stated the fact that our society only had half a mind because half of our people were not being allowed to think or contribute. And that was her main point, is that allow that other half to contribute equally, and we're going to be greater for it. We're going to have more ideas, we're going to have better ideas, we're going to have more solutions to problems. I think she also saw, as everybody saw in 1911 and 1915, that we were rushing down a path towards World War I and ultimately World War II. And I think maybe Gilman's, along with a lot of other people who were early socialist thinkers at that time, saw that the path we were taking was leading to destruction, and that to solve it, we needed to work together. We needed to all be a team instead of all be against one another. Mm-hmm. And I think that's still relevant. The socialist label, of course, makes everybody want to flee from it, but we all do need to work as a team. We don't have a society. We don't have a civilization if we don't work together. And that's what she was trying to get, she was taking the concept of motherhood over children and extending that to, we should have that attitude towards society of nurture all of our people rather than just leave them there on their own to try and struggle and survive. Mm-hmm. That we would have a better, stronger, more successful civilization by working together. Mm-hmm. And not leaving people out of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Not being exclusionary and excluding people. That's actually a really good segue into kind of the next thing. A lot of, so the way that Herland really sets up their education system is they school without having a school. They don't have buildings or establishments to educate their daughters. They kind of nurture them in a direction that they see the child as individually choosing. So the interests of the child, they start once they start seeing that the child has interests at all, they start kind of pushing the child in that direction, gently educating them, teaching them, getting them involved, getting them interested, letting them go and hang out with the other women who are, doing that craft or doing, the engineering or doing the gardening or who are doing, whatever they're doing that the child is interested in. So in a way, it's not necessarily not individualist, because they are recognizing the autonomy of the child in and of themselves and allowing them to kind of choose their direction of education instead of being, like in today's world. And by the time you're in 12th grade, they want you to have your life figured out. Like, are you going to go to college? What are you going to do with your life? What are you going to be? They don't necessarily care about your interests at that point. A lot of the time, parents are like, what's going to make you money? Or your teachers even, what's going to make you money? But in Herland, because their economic system is so dynamic and so collectivist, they don't have that worry where the child's not going to be taken care of. Like, the whole community takes care of, the entire village, so to speak, takes care of the child. And they all take responsibility for educating that child, and they all take responsibility for making sure that child is safe and protected and nurtured and, knows the rules of society and becomes and develops into a thriving citizen instead of just an existing one, so that they contribute better and contribute within their interests. So I think that's actually really cool. A really cool concept for education. It's kind of almost, what is it? Montessori or Montessori?
Yeah.
Is that how you say it?
Basically the Montessori.
Yeah, Montessori. That's how
ideal of schools that actually has been put into practice in certain institutions.
Yeah. So it's kind of taking it even to a next level and being like, it's homeschooling, but by the whole village. And based off of what the child shows interest in, which I thought was really cool and very individualist when you think about it, because that's just about the only way in this society that they focus on an individual is when they are learning and when they are starting to develop an interest in a craft or in a trade of some kind. And I thought that was really, really interesting and super cool and kind of a contrast to the whole collectivist ideal. Like, yes, they're doing it for the greater good of all because you're making this functioning person, but that's a lot of time and investment in an individual in order to be able to get them where they want to be, where they enjoy what they're doing. So I thought that was very interesting. So how do we know that this is truly a female utopia? That is a question that kind of comes up a lot in the literature, where we have these gentlemen are trying to figure out, like, is there actually something wrong with this society? And the women discuss some of the things that they wish to change, but there was one quote for sure. One quote that I have, I gotta pull it up here, where I knew for sure this was a female utopia from my perspective, and it was this. I see that I have not remarked that these women had pockets in surprising number and variety. They were in all their garments, and the middle one in particular was shingled with them. This was written 90 years ago, and women are still asking for frickin' pockets in their pants. 90 years. We get them in dresses, but they still haven't got it through their heads that we want them in our pants. That's how I knew this was a utopia. Because these women have pockets, insurmountable amounts of pockets, in attractive clothing, and that was a big deal. And I'm just like, in 90 years, no one has figured out women just want pockets in clothes. That would truly be a feminist utopia. That's how I know we have arrived. Is when women get reasonable sized pockets in their clothing. So just a funny, friendly aside, but seriously, somebody make pockets in clothing for women that actually function. We need this. It's important. Was there anything else that you wanted to...
Yeah, my perspective on this book is obviously a little different, but I don't see this so much as a feminist novel as just a search for solutions to problems. Mm-hmm. You know, Gilman took a very rational approach to looking at her world and saying, why is it this way? You know, she didn't just accept things because that's the way it always was or that's the way it is. She threw aside those concepts and said, why does it need to be this way? It does, and came up with the answer that it doesn't need to be that way. You know, why did we only have half of our society providing ideas for things? Why didn't we let the other half get involved too? She asked those hard questions. Why did we have food that made people sick? You know, if you've read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, you know that was written back around that time, how horrible food processing was in the Chicago stockyards. And Gilman called for something like the FDA, and we eventually did actually do that. A lot of her ideas in the years since she wrote this novel, we actually have tried. And no, it hasn't resulted in utopia, but that's just because of reality, that utopia is a perfect world, and we are not perfect, and our world will never be perfect because we are not perfect, because there's too many of us that would disagree with just what form perfection should take for us to ever get on the same page and make it happen. The other issue I had with the novel as a novel is that there were a lot of things that just weren't logical, like when the cataclysm happened and all the men were wiped out, and then before 60 years could go by and people all died off, all of a sudden parthenogenesis happens. That's unrealistic. In the real world, you would never, if parthenogenesis was possible, it's something that would develop through genetics over many, many, many thousands of years before it would actually be workable. So kind of some unrealistic things, but you got to remember these are just plot devices in order to get us to where Gilman can make her point. Mm-hmm. And the other side of it is towards about halfway through the novel, these women start talking about wanting to bring men into their society and wanting to get married. Well, why? They didn't need it. Mm-hmm. They were completely self-sufficient, and they had never even seen men for 2,000 years. A realist would say the moment these women would see these men, they'd slaughter them and cut them up for bacon or something, because they
all
would
vegan.
think they were
they
animals.
Wouldn't have done that.
Well, but I mean,
yeah, no, I
they
see
would
what you're saying.
see these men as wild animals or something, not human beings, not something that they needed in their society. And so that whole device of these women wanting to bring men into their society, I thought it was nice, but I thought, well, why? It didn't make logical sense. So there are some logical holes in the story, but overall it was an easy read, it was a quick read, and it was an enjoyable read. And that's the point we want to make about these classics, is that while books like this are making these important philosophical points back then, they also were telling entertaining stories. And Gilman told a good story here.
And this one is a lot of irony of ironies. I think that's what made this so entertaining, is you have these men in this unusual predicament where they're in a society that is totally unlike their own. Women as they know it are not at all the same way. The women just see themselves as people, and they see these men as people. And they think, oh, well, let's just integrate these men into our culture because we're all just people. If you can give a logic to it. I totally get what you were saying before. Like, it seems kind of illogical for them, other than potentially being like a scientific study of some sort, which it could be, and they just didn't mention it in the book. Or it's like, we're all just people. We'll just hang out and make it all work. You know, like, they just thought this wouldn't be a problem. But you have these guys who are constantly shoving their foot in their mouth because they're like, well, why do the moms just stay home? Do they do anything else when they're there? Do they have careers and stuff? Oh, yeah, only the poor ones. And then the women are like how poor are we talking? Like, wait, there's poverty? Where you come from? Like, things like that. It kind of fumbles into these snowball effects, and then the guys are trying to, like, dismiss it, like, no, it's not that bad. But then they're like, oh, goodness, how do we talk ourselves out of this one? So a lot of it is that kind of humor, too, where you're just kind of like, wow, these guys are really putting their foot in their mouth. They're really in an uncomfortable situation, and they really are realizing that their lives aren't that great. And the way they treat women in their society isn't that great, and the way they run their economy maybe isn't that great. So it's almost like the two cultures are colliding, thinking, oh, we are kind of like Candide. We're the best of all possible worlds, but they come from completely different worlds. So there's a lot of humor in that. There's a lot of really great situations. There are some not so great situations even where things are irreparable. That's kind of what the book concludes with, is a big, massive taboo, I guess, cultural taboo that these women did not expect to happen, and suddenly they're like, we got to do something about this. This is not okay. So they have to address the issues and address the differences in their cultures and deal with this huge event in order to get back to a sense of normal. So, I mean, it's really, really interesting, and it builds well, I think. I think the culture itself is very vibrant and fun to play with the idea of, and very thought-provoking and interesting. So it's very entertaining.
Yeah, so even though it's an easy book and not what you expect when you think of literature and classics, it's got a lot of depth to it, and it is enjoyable to read. And that's really what we're looking for with Telltale, is to get across to you that there are these older books that have all these brilliant ideas and are exciting reading and fun reading. And I think this book definitely falls into that, no matter what you think of the logical holes in the story. Yeah.
So yeah, that's, I guess I should probably do a quote or something, huh?
If you got one. If you got a good one.
I had some from Herland that I really did like.
I came across a lot of them in the final book with her and Herland. There were a lot of great quotes in that.
I can't wait to read that one. I actually do want to read all of it. But awkward time on the phone. I should really have this pulled up. I'm stumbling through this.
Yeah, if anybody wants to read the whole trilogy, Moving Them Out into Herland and With Her and Herland, understand that the first and third books don't have much story. They're mostly about ideas. And they are mostly written to contrast with this idea of this utopia.
All right, so in chapter 12, it's a little bit long-winded. It's almost a whole paragraph, but it's really thought-provoking, and it really stirred a lot of emotions in me. So it's in chapter 12, and it starts with, "We talk fine things about women, but in our hearts we know that they are very limited beings, most of them. We honor them for their functional powers, even while we dishonor them by our use of it. We honor them for their carefully enforced virtue, even while we show by our own conduct how little we think of that virtue. We value them sincerely for the perverted maternal activities which make our wives the most comfortable of servants, bound to us for life with the wages wholly at our own decision, their whole business outside of the temporary duties of such motherhood as they may achieve, to meet our needs in every way. Oh, we value them all right, in their place, which place is home, where they perform that mixture of duties so amiably described by Mrs. Josephine Dodge Dascom Bacon, in which the services of a mistress are carefully specified." And so I liked that quote because he was being absolutely raw and honest about the way he recognized that his society, and himself included, treated women. And this was in the context of they were trying to build houses and have a home with these women. At one point, the gentlemen actually start courting and marry some women in the society, and they're trying to convince them, let's build a house. And they're like, why? In our society, you can live wherever you want. We have, they basically had public buildings where you can just kind of come and go as you please to any community, and you'll have a place to stay. So they were trying to understand this concept of personal ownership because they had never had it before. And the gentlemen were having such a hard time describing why it was so important to them to have a home. And this is when he realizes we recognize women based off of how we recognize them in our society, which is in a particular place. These women don't have a place. These women belong to each other and this land and this community, and they have this bigger and greater idea of self and a bigger and greater idea of community than we do. And so this is the sociologist, Van, his name is. He's kind of coming into this realization of, wow, this is a whole different, almost deified dynamic of motherhood and sisterhood that I don't think our culture would ever understand, much less us men struggling now, even for something as basic as ownership. We just don't get it. And realizing his failure, I think, in his culture and himself. And I found that very profound and heartbreaking, even, that he had to come to this conclusion. So that was one of my favorite quotes, I think, in the whole book, was when he finally was like, man, we done wrong. We done real wrong.
Uh-huh.
So that was a really good one.
Okay, so I think this is a book we recommend if you want to look for something
Definitely.
other than the usual classic and something that you will enjoy reading, unless you just totally hate all of these ideas we've talked about. Then it's definitely not a book for you.
Yeah, it does deal with a lot of very interesting social issues. It is a social commentary as well as a feminist work, but I think overall you can just appreciate it for the story it is and the ideas that it has. If you're able to kind of just want to read it for the storyline or for having, this experience in this different world, I think it would be okay. But yes, there's a lot of thought-provoking materials that are very deep, that if you think about them too hard, it might be hard for you to get through the book. But it actually is it's really well written. It's a very compelling story. I found myself kind of page turning because and then what happens? And how do they talk themselves out of this one? And how do the women deal with that situation? So there's a lot of compelling stuff that happens that really pulls you through the story nicely. So I think it's a good one.
Yep.
Enjoy it.
Yeah, go find it.
Yeah.
Read it. And come back and report to us what you think.
Yeah, leave comments about anything. If you read it, we would love to hear from you, hear your thoughts on it, anything you loved about it, anything you hate about it. Go ahead and subscribe to our channel and let us know if there's anything you want us to read. We always take recommendations and we'd love to do reviews. So yeah, let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, see you next time.
Bye.